For years, the West has talked about China as if it were something almost superhuman. A civilization that thinks in centuries, a state that always plans ahead, a disciplined machine buying the future while democracies bicker, panic, and waste time. But I've heard this music before. I was born in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union also looked formidable from the outside. It had giant projects, impressive statistics, military spectacle, and a ruling class that spoke in the tone of historical inevitability. A lot of people in the West looked at the theater and mistook it for lasting strength. That was a mistake then, and it may be a mistake now. Authoritarian systems are very good at projecting power long after they've started rotting from within. So here's the real question. What happens if we stop looking at China as a myth and start looking at it as a system? And if that system follows many of the same political and economic patterns the Soviet Union followed, why would we expect a different result? I'm Elvira Bary. I was born in the Soviet Union, and today I want to show you why modern authoritarianism keeps summoning the same old ghosts. Here's our roadmap for today. The Legitimacy Trap. Why authoritarian rulers must constantly perform success. The Mirage Numbers. How censorship turns rulers into believers in their own fiction. Loyalty over brains. Why obedient bureaucracies build impressive failures. Concrete theater. Why megaprojects look like power long before they produce value. The Soviet mirror. How China's foreign influence follows the same authoritarian script. Offshore lifeboats. What globalization changed for corrupt elites in Russia and China. The last resort. Why stagnating authoritarian states start reaching for war. If you want to support independent analysis like this, you can join my think tank or use PayPal, Super Thanks, or Hype Points. And if you are listening on Spotify, hit follow so the next episode lands in your feed. The Legitimacy Trap. Every authoritarian regime has one problem that never goes away. It's the legitimacy question. Why should anyone obey you? A king in the old world had a simple answer. God chose me. My father wore the crown before me. My family is the state. In a democracy, the answer is also simple, at least in theory. I was chosen through a procedure. The people can remove me. The rules matter more than my personality. But a modern authoritarian ruler has no such comfort. He was not chosen by God. He was not honestly chosen by voters. He rose through intrigue, coercion, bureaucracy, force, or party machinery. So he must constantly prove that his power is justified. If his regime can provide economic growth, that's the cleanest solution. Rising incomes and new apartments are persuasive. They calm a society very effectively. But if growth slows, or if the benefits stop reaching ordinary people, the regime needs another language of legitimacy. That language is grandeur, military strength, historic missions, national destiny, great victories ahead, great humiliations avenged. This performance is not aimed only at the public. In an authoritarian state, the ruler depends less on sincere love from the masses than an obedience from the bureaucracy. It is the bureaucracy that carries out orders and suppresses trouble. So the regime must constantly reassure its own apparatus that it is stable, feared, victorious, and going somewhere important. That was true in the Soviet Union, and it is true in China. The whole machine runs on demonstration. Look how much we build. Look how fast we move. Look how disciplined we are. Look how the West decays while we rise. Look at our railways, our skyscrapers, our armies, our giant anniversaries, our confident leaders. And that is how authoritarian power begins to rot from within. It grows addicted not to actual results, but to spectacle of results. The Soviet Union taught this lesson very clearly. For years it looked massive, disciplined, and permanent. Then, almost at once, it looked brittle, poor, and absurd. Not because its weaknesses appeared overnight, but because the system had spent decades burying them under ceremony, propaganda, and false reporting. The problems kept accumulating until they could no longer be concealed. The Mirage Numbers. Once a regime needs constant proof of success, it develops a dangerous habit. It starts lying not only to outsiders, but even to itself. The Soviet Union did not simply censor dissidents, it also lied about production, harvests, population, and the actual state of the economy. On paper, everything looked better than it was in reality. And these fake numbers were not meant only for Western consumption. They seeped into the entire system. The reports leaders used to make decisions, the textbooks students learned from, the assumptions officials built policy on. One of the clearest examples came in 1937. The Soviet census produced a population figure far below what Stalin had publicly implied the country should have. Instead of accepting the result, the regime declared the census defective, suppressed it, arrested many of the statisticians involved, and later replaced it with a new census whose published totals were more politically convenient. In other words, when reality contradicted the myth, the state punished reality. China works differently, in style, but not in mechanism. Chinese officials do not usually announce absurd fantasies in the grand theatrical language the Soviets loved. Their style is smoother, more technocratic, more polished, but the pressure underneath is familiar. Hit the growth target. Protect the image. Do not embarrass your superiors. And we do not have to guess how this works. In Liaoning, one of China's Rust Belt provinces, officials admitted that fiscal data has been falsified for years, and the National Bureau of Statistics later revised the province's GDP estimate down by more than 20%. Around the same period, Inner Mongolia slashed its reported 2016 industrial output by 40% after earlier falsifications were uncovered. These were not rounding errors. They were proof that local officials had been sending politically useful fiction upward through the system. That is why it matters that in 2024, Beijing again vowed to punish officials for falsifying economic data. It made similar warnings in 2022 as well. Think about what that means. If the state has to keep publicly reminding officials not to fake the numbers, then fake numbers are not rare accidents. They are a recurring product of the system itself. Why does it happen? Because a local official is judged by the numbers he sends upward. Bad numbers are treated as his personal failure, not the system's failure. His career, reputation, and safety depend on whether his superior likes the report. So when reality disappoints, the temptation is obvious. Adjust the number. Delay the bad news. Buy time. Hope the next quarter looks better. And here is where the problem becomes truly dangerous. Fake numbers blind not only the public, but the ruler as well. If bad news is softened, messaged, or delayed at every level, the leadership begins to live inside its own hallucination. It watches television, reads reports, listens to subordinates, and gradually starts believing that the country on paper is close enough to the country outside the window. This is how authoritarian systems grow stupid. while still looking strong. Loyalty over brains. Authoritarian rulers say they want competence, but what they really want is safe competence. Competence that does not challenge them and knows when to shut up. When forced to choose between a brilliant subordinate and a loyal one, authoritarian systems usually choose loyalty. This was a chronic Soviet disease, and it is one of the best ways to understand China now. In a normal system, a talented person who solves problems should be valuable even if he is awkward, blunt, or politically inconvenient. In an authoritarian one, that same person is dangerous. He sees too much. He may become popular. He may start believing that he deserves a say in how the system is run. That is intolerable. So the ladder bends. Careers are built not only on skill but on caution, conformity, family ties, factional loyalty, and the ability to protect the chain of command from embarrassment. Ambitious people in China still rise through performance reviews and provincial posts, but talent survives only when it is politically eligible and emotionally safe for the structure above it. This is the same logic we know so well from Russia. A loyal official with the right connections is worth more than a smart one who asks unwelcome questions. In Russia, that produces clan rule, absurd appointments, fear of responsibility, and a system where failure is forgiven if the person who failed belongs to the right circle. In China, the style is cleaner, but the instinct is familiar. Safety first, truth second. Concrete theater. Authoritarian systems love megaprojects because they look impressive, like destiny, progress, and history in making. You can film them from a helicopter, put them on a poster, integrate them in a hard hat, and call it a leap into the future. That is exactly why such systems keep falling for building big things. Big and loud megaprojects produce shiny reports long before they produce meaningful economic benefits. A real economy is messy. It depends on private risk, small decisions, trust, contracts, and supply chains. You cannot fake that easily, but you can build a giant structure and announce that prosperity will naturally follow. This is where China's foreign policy starts looking very Soviet. A bureaucracy trained to impress superiors and avoid embarrassment gets sent abroad with money, political orders, and a mandate to show results. So it does what such bureaucracies always do, reaches for visible scale. And this is why so many Belt and Road projects became symbols of strain instead of triumph. Take Montenegro. In 2014, Montenegro signed a roughly €800 million financing deal with China's Exim Bank for the first section of the Barbalara Highway, despite IMF warnings that it threatened fiscal stability. Years later, Reuters described the project as a Chinese-funded highway to nowhere, reflecting criticism that the expensive first stretch imposed a heavy debt burden before the wider route was completed. Or take another China's project in Myanmar, the Kyaikpyu deep sea port. In 2018, Myanmar scaled down the cost from $7.3 billion to around $1.3 billion because officials feared the debt burden. That is what happens when somebody finally looks past the ceremony and asks the root question: who is actually going to pay for this? The Soviet mirror. Why does China's foreign policy and overseas projects look so familiar to anyone who knows Soviet history? Because the Soviet Union ran a very similar script. China is richer, more technically capable, and much better integrated into the world economy, but the pattern is old. A closed authoritarian power, distrusted by the democratic world, starts looking for clients and partners among weaker regimes. It offers money, infrastructure, cheap credit, military help, diplomatic backing, or some mixture of all five. Then it presents this network as proof that history is shifting in its favor. The USSR did this all the time. It built patron-client relationships with countries like Cuba, Vietnam, Ethiopia, Angola, Nicaragua, and others. Even by the Gorbachev era, the Soviet Union still had such relationships and was paying a lot for their loyalty. That is the key word, loyalty. These were not partnerships built on shared prosperity or aimed to make the local population rich and free. The USSR built these strategic relationships to expand influence, deny ground to rivals, and create the feeling that the socialist world was broad, dynamic, and historically irresistible. China does something softer and more commercial, but it's playing with many of the same authoritarian instincts. The strongest democracies are never going to be its friends. They are too transparent, too legalistic, too hard to bribe at scale. So China finds more room in places where elites are weaker, institutions thinner, and rulers more interested in regime survival than public accountability. That's how larger authoritarian powers end up feeding smaller dictators. They offer loans, ports, roads, power plants, telecom networks, rail projects, budget relief, or political cover. In return, they get access, UN votes, influence, gratitude, leverage, and one more speech about the dawn of a new world order. But this kind of empire is expensive because it rests on weak economics and bad governance on both sides. That is why it is so rarely produces healthy outcomes. Wherever the USSR poured in money, weapons, advisors, or prestige projects, the result was not some shining belt of prosperity. It was dependency, militarization, repression, stagnation, or all four together. China has more engineers, better logistics, better financing tools, and far more real commercial capacity. But once it starts operating through the same authoritarian logic, it inherits the same disease. The data already shows strain in China's global expansion. By 2022, 60% of China's overseas lending portfolio supported countries in distress, up from just 5% in 2010. This strategy does not look like investing in growth, more like bailing out friendly regimes and buying their loyalty. In Africa, Chinese loan commitments remain far below their peak years, just about $2 billion in 2024. China is not pulling away just yet, but it can no longer afford its past mode of unstoppable power projection. Before we move on, I'd like to show you a short trailer for my historical novel set in China during the Roaring Twenties, The White Ghost Empire. I want to tell you a story about a city once called the Splendor of the East and the Whore of Asia. Shanghai, the 1920s, jazz drifting through open windows, opium smoke curling beneath chandeliers, white colonists in white suits, certain they were untouchable. Then the Russians arrived, not as conquerors, as refugees. Thousands fleeing the Bolsheviks, stepping onto the docks with nothing. To survive, they scrubbed floors, hauled crates, worked for a bowl of rice. And in doing so, they shattered the illusion of white supremacy, while the Chinese watched closely. And somewhere far away, Moscow was watching too, quietly dreaming of turning the ancient celestial empire into its greatest prize. The White Ghost's Empire, a historical novel about exile rising from the ashes and the clash of the mightiest powers on earth. Offshore lifeboats. There is one very important difference between China today and the old Soviet Union. Globalization gave authoritarian elites something Soviet elites never had at the same scale: exit options. The Soviet bureaucrat lived inside the cage. He could steal, yes. He could enjoy privileges, yes. But his world was still trapped inside the Soviet system. Today's authoritarian official can think in two directions at once. He can serve the regime at home and quietly prepare an escape route abroad. That changes the psychology of power. Because once officials can move money, property, spouses, children, education, and backup plans into safer countries, their incentives get even worse. The question is no longer just how do I climb? It becomes how much can I secure before the weather changes? This is where Russia and China suddenly look very close. In Russia, this problem became so obvious that Putin in 2013 pushed an overseas asset ban for officials. The state was worried that elites with money abroad might become foreign-dependent politicians. In other words, the Kremlin understood perfectly well that its own ruling class did not trust the system enough to keep everything inside it. A regime that constantly preaches patriotism had to pressure its own officials not to park their safety elsewhere. China has its own version of the same fear. Reuters reported this year that Beijing tightened restrictions on officials and executives at state bodies and state-owned enterprises who have family members overseas. Again, think about what that tells you. The Chinese state knows that loyalty becomes unstable when family assets and future options migrate abroad. With exit options in the picture, China's grand foreign infrastructure projects now serve more than one purpose. They make the official look competent and effective, and they also create opportunities for extraction. For his children to study in London, Vancouver, Singapore, or somewhere else safely outside the reach of the ruler's next perch. That makes modern authoritarian expansion even more rotten than the Soviet version. And this is another reason the West should stop romanticizing authoritarian efficiency. These systems are not held together by noble discipline and shared belief in a great mission. They are instead held together by fear, opportunism, and the constant private search for a lifeboat. The last resort. Authoritarian systems draw much of their legitimacy from economic growth and improving living standards. A population can forgive many things if life keeps getting better. But once the growth slows, the regime must find another way to prove that it still deserves obedience. And that's when it brings overstated foreign danger into the room. It reminds everyone that they live in a fortress encircled by enemies, and that only unity under the current rulers can save them. We know this pattern very well from Russia. China is not Russia, but the mechanism is familiar. As economic growth has slowed and confidence in the system has become shakier, security has moved to the center of the political stage. Taiwan becomes not just a strategic issue, but a stage on which resolve can be demonstrated again and again. Taiwan's defense minister now calls China a pressing threat because of its continuing military expansion around the island. US intelligence assess China is not currently planning to invade Taiwan in 2027, but expects coercive pressure to intensify through 2026. In other words, even if war is not imminent, the regime still finds political value in constant demonstrations of force. In authoritarian politics, weapons talk, and ultimately war is a powerful way to gain legitimacy. It's their last resort when all the rest have failed. This is why slowing growth is such a dangerous moment in any authoritarian system. That's when the whole system gets uglier. Security services gain weight, propaganda grows harsher, the price of dissent rises, the bureaucracy becomes more nervous, bad news becomes more dangerous to report. You can see all of that in Soviet history. It led to the invasion of Afghanistan. You can see it in Russia now. It led to the invasion of Ukraine. And the West should expect to see more of it in China. Before you go, I want to ask you something specific. What's one claim about China that you've heard or seen that sounded genuinely impressive at first? A megaproject, a growth statistic, a technology story, a discipline argument, something that made you think maybe they really are stronger, smarter, faster. And then tell me, do you still believe it? Or why not? If this episode helped you see China through a sharper lens, please like the video and subscribe. Share it with one person who still believes authoritarian efficiency is the future. And if you want to support this work directly, you can join my think tank or use PayPal or Super Thanks. You can also tap hype points to help this episode travel. And for those listening on Spotify, hit follow so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for watching. See you next time.